Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a really deep systems-level analysis of Noam Chomsky's foundational work, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies.
That title alone is, it's such a brilliant and immediate paradox.
It is.
In a society that supposedly guarantees an informed public debate, freedom of the press, all the hallmarks of democracy, Chomsky poses this core, kind of unnerving question.
Which is, how is public opinion actually managed? How is it shaped by political and media systems, often, without the public even realizing it's happening?
It forces you to confront this hypocrisy that's kind of baked into how we define ourselves. We'll all just naturally accept that thought control exists in totalitarian states, through overt censorship and fear.
Of course. But Chomsky's work, it really demands that we analyze the more subtle, the institutionalized mechanisms of thought control that operate within societies that, vigorously define themselves as fundamentally free and democratic.
And that's why the very act of suggesting we need to democratize the media just instantly sounds radical. It sounds almost subversive.
It does. Because the default assumption is that the media is already independent.
Right, that it's already fulfilling its mission to inform the public without fear or favor.
Exactly. So to suggest otherwise implies there's a systemic flaw in the democratic order itself.
So if the citizenry, the people who are supposed to be sovereign in a democracy, if they are being systematically manipulated,
if the process of their consent is, in his words, manufactured,
then the whole democratic framework is functionally constrained. It's not what it claims to be.
And to address that, we really have to emphasize that our mission here, much like Chomsky's, is to perform a systems-level analysis.
This is so crucial. We're not interested in the psychological or, the moral failings of individual reporters or editors or politicians.
No, this isn't about blaming people. We are looking for the deep structural, the institutional factors.
Things like the economic, the political, the corporate constraints.
Exactly. The things that determine the boundaries of what is acceptable thought and, explain why the system produces these very predictable informational outcomes.
Okay, so let's unpack the intellectual landscape that birthed this analysis. We should probably start with the author himself.
Sure. Noam Chomsky is, of course, kind of a dual powerhouse. He's known globally for his work in linguistics.
Which is revolutionary in its own right.
Absolutely. But he's equally prominent as a political analyst and a relentless media critic. Necessary Illusions doesn't just stand alone. It's part of a decades-long effort to investigate the substantive reality of freedom of the press.
And to really dissect what kind of democratic order the elite discourse truly wishes to uphold.
Right. And you have to understand the political environment the book was conceived in. It's really crucial to understanding the critique.
We're talking about the post-Vietnam and post-Watergate era.
Yes, a period often referred to by, mainstream commentators as the crisis of democracy.
What do they mean by that?
Well, following the 60s and early 70s, there was this measurable right turn among elite groups.
Okay.
So domestically, this meant things like dismantling social programs, initiating a huge resource transfer from the poor to the wealthy.
And using the military system as a massive state-guaranteed subsidy for high-tech industries.
Exactly. But alongside that shift, there was this public critique, often coming from very establishment figures, like the Trilateral Commission.
And their argument was what? That the media had gone too far.
Precisely. They were alleging that the media had become too critical, too adversarial, and was therefore undermining necessary authority.
The establishment felt threatened. They were worried the public was becoming too engaged, maybe too questioning for its own good.
That's the narrative, and Chomsky just counters this dominant narrative completely. He argues that the media wasn't adversarial at all.
So what was it doing then?
Instead, it was simply being vigilant in protecting the bounds of acceptable debate. And by doing that, it was protecting entrenched privilege and elite interests from any kind of meaningful public scrutiny.
So if we strip away all the historical context, the philosophical framing for a moment, what is the absolute core thesis the book is trying to prove about Western capitalist democracies?
The book argues that in societies where the state can't just use direct force to control people's minds, public opinion must be subtly managed.
It has to be.
It has to be, in order to ensure the protection of entrenched privilege and maintain stability within the system. The specialized class, the elites, they view the general population as simply too ignorant, too emotional, or frankly, too stupid to judge their own interests wisely.
So for their own good, they have to be kept in a state of, what, controlled ignorance?
Yes. Reduced to what Chomsky calls jingoist incantations. It's for their own supposed good. The ultimate goal of this entire system is the systematic manufacture of consent,
By ensuring the public remains a passive object of manipulation.
rather than an active, informed, and critical participant in thought, in debate, and in decision-making.
That sets the stage perfectly for us to explore the actual mechanisms. So let's dive into the namesake concept, the doctrine of necessary illusion. What are these illusions, and I mean, how does this specialized class justify creating them in the first place?
So necessary illusions are, in his words, the emotionally potent oversimplifications that are designed by the elite to keep the masses disciplined and, well, content.
So these are narratives.
They're narratives that are required to sustain power structures, things like the inherent nobility of our national purpose, or the unquestionable rationality of the free market, or maybe the purely defensive nature of any state actions.
And Chomsky is careful to show that this idea isn't some, fringe conspiracy theory. It's actually rooted deeply in the history of democratic thought among the governing elites themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to go back to the aftermath of World War I, where democratic systems were suddenly facing the reality of mass participation. And Walter Lippmann, who was a towering figure in American journalism and public thought, he called the manufacture of consent a self-conscious art. And get this, a regular organ of popular government.
Wow. So it's not a bug, it's a feature.
It's a necessary feature. He wrote very compellingly that the common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely, and therefore they must be distilled and managed by a specialized class.
And that distinction is so key, this idea that the complexity of modern life is just too great for the average person to grasp.
Which then justifies management by experts.
It's the foundational democratic dogma that Chomsky is critiquing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the public are just spectators, they're not actual participants.
That's it. And then, 15 years after Lippmann, you have Harold Lasswell, another highly influential political scientist, reinforcing this exact idea.
What did he add to it?
He urged the specialized class not to succumb to democratic dogmatisms, this idea that men are the best judges of their own interests. Lasswell concluded that because industrial social arrangements might deny elites the pure brute force to compel obedience,
They need a different tool.
they must rely on a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda, to manage the ignorance and superstition of the masses.
So it's not hidden at all. It's an explicit policy prescription. And this brings us right back to the crucial role of the intellectual class. If consent needs manufacturing, then they are the engineers.
And they're also the primary targets of the propaganda themselves.
How does that work?
They are the cool observers who have to create and crucially internalize these necessary illusions. The institutional filtering system works by rewarding and promoting those who readily adopt beliefs that serve institutional needs.
Beliefs like the idea that the system is fundamentally just, that U.S. power is benevolent, that the domestic framework protects freedom.
All of that.
And for those who fail to adopt those beliefs, the ones who don't buy in,
They're simply marginalized. They have to seek employment elsewhere, outside the major media institutions, outside the dominant think tanks, and outside of the accepted academic consensus. It's a very efficient system of filtering people out.
And Chomsky connects this mechanism to the analogy of the Grand Inquisitor.
He does. The Grand Inquisitor operates not out of cruelty, but out of this perverse sense of benevolence.
Right. He manages the impotent rebels for their own happiness, using miracle, mystery, and authority.
Precisely. And the cool observer, the modern intellectual, sincerely believes they are guiding the ignorant masses toward a greater good stability, prosperity, security, by shielding them from uncomfortable truths and complex reality.
So they're providing those emotional oversimplifications that keep the populace docile.
Yes, and the insidious nature of the system is that it often requires genuine self-deception on the part of the intellectual.
Because you are more effective at manufacturing consent if you sincerely believe the necessary illusion yourself.
You're much more effective.
That is a very powerful framework. Now let's move from the intellectual justification to the literal machinery of dissemination. The media system itself. We often talk about the free market of ideas, but Chomsky shows us that this market is actually heavily regulated by corporate power.
The so-called free market of ideas effectively operates to disseminate the beliefs, the values, and the ideas of the upper classes.
while at the same time structurally subverting the ideological independence of the lower classes.
Right. To understand this, you first have to recognize what media outlets really are. They are not public service entities. They are massive corporations, deeply integrated through ownership and, cross-directorships with larger financial conglomerates.
And this corporate identity, it fundamentally shifts the core transaction of what journalism is. It's not about the viewer in the news.
Not at all. We have to identify the real customer and the real product. The product is not information sold to the general public.
So what is it?
The market is advertisers, and the product being sold to them is audiences.
And crucially, the system naturally prioritizes wealthier audiences.
Of course, because they command higher advertising rates. This commercial imperative automatically steers the content and the framing toward the interests and the sensibilities of the financial and corporate class, whose primary function is buying those audiences.
So the constraint is just built in. You don't need a phone call from the White House telling you what to say.
You don't.
You just need to follow the money.
The constraint is structural. But, sometimes the enforcement is a bit more direct, which provides a useful warning to others.
And Chomsky provides a specific example of this, right?
He does. The public television station WNET, which lost vital corporate underwriting from Gulf plus Western.
And the reason was?
They aired a documentary called Hunger for Profit, which critically examined the conduct of multinational corporations in the Third World.
And that implication, that lost funding, it must have sent shockwaves through public broadcasting.
It did. The Gulf plus Western executive described the documentary as virulently anti-business, if not anti-American.
It questioned the standard narrative that these corporations were benign forces for development.
And the lesson delivered was swift and clear. If you bite the corporate hand that feeds public broadcasting, that hand will retract the food source. So media outlets learn very quickly and very efficiently to be sympathetic to the most delicate sensitivities of corporations.
That implicit threat, just the threat of losing access to capital,
Yeah.
is what defines the system.
Exactly. And this leads us to the true societal purpose of the media, as Chomsky would define it.
Which is not objective reporting.
No. It is to train the minds of the people to a virtuous attachment to their government and to the accepted economic and social arrangements. They function as vigilant guardians, constantly protecting entrenched privilege from the threat of a truly informed public understanding and participation.
This guarding function is probably best observed in the concept he calls dichotomous treatment.
Yes.
This idea that the system needs to define reality by sorting facts into sort of worthy and unworthy categories.
This is where the evidence for the propaganda model becomes, almost undeniable, because the difference in coverage is not random. It's highly systematic and it's predictable.
So any well-documented evidence of U.S. or client state aggression, say the bombing campaigns in Indochina or abuses in Central America,
that is routinely treated as unwelcome and therefore a non-fact within the mainstream narrative.
but if the exact same act is attributable to an official enemy,
Then the condemnation requires no argument. Condemnation of Soviet aggression in Afghanistan or state-supported terrorism by Iran, it becomes a matter of absolute moral certainty. The media establishes the worthy victim versus the unworthy victim framework.
let's elaborate on this distinction with some concrete examples. What characterizes the coverage of a worthy victim?
So crimes that are attributable to official enemies, like the atrocities in Cambodia under Pol Pot, they elicit massive outrage, demands for justice, vivid, almost endless detail.
And an insistence that the crimes originate at the highest level of planning.
Right. And sometimes this outrage is so necessary for the ideological framework that it even leads to the fabrication of evidence, which is then just accepted wholesale by the compliant media.
And when the United States or its client states bear responsibility, the unworthy victims.
The response is the polar opposite. You find systematic silence, you find outright apologetics, a meticulous avoidance of specific, gruesome detail.
And a narrowing of the focus.
A narrowing of focus, yes. The incident is reframed as an understandable error or an aberration, or maybe the result of a few bad actors with personality defects, which thereby insulates the system itself from any critique.
One of the most, I think, horrifying examples Chomsky draws on is the case of East Timor.
It is a devastating case study. Following Indonesia's invasion of East Timor in 1975, the atrocities escalated, reaching genocidal levels throughout the late 70s and 80s.
And this coincided directly with increased U.S. military aid and diplomatic support for Indonesia.
A crucial U.S. client state. And Chomsky notes that during the peak years of mass slaughter, with hundreds of thousands killed, media coverage in the United States effectively went to flat zero.
Flat zero.
The victims were unworthy because their tormentor, Indonesia, was an important strategic ally for U.S. interests. Their suffering was, for all intents and purposes, a non-fact.
You can contrast that with the media outrage surrounding air disasters. This dichotomy illustrates the principle perfectly.
Yes, the contrast he draws between the Soviet downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in 1983.
KL-007.
Right. And the U.S. Navy's downing of Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, which killed 290 civilians, is highly instructive.
Okay, so when the Soviet military shot down KL-007, the media response was one of uniform global condemnation.
The media barrage was intense. It was described as an act of cold-blooded barbarism, an intentional murder of innocents stemming from the highest levels of Soviet malice and indifference to human life. The incident was treated as proof of the Soviet system's inherent evil.
But then, 5 years later, when the advanced U.S. Navy cruiser Vincennes shot down the Iranian civilian jet, killing 290 people, how was that handled?
The immediate media reaction was to reframe the incident entirely. There was no widespread moral outrage.
No.
Instead, the focus shifted to the extreme duress and the understandable error of the Vincennes commander. The captain, William C. Rogers, was widely portrayed as a courageous professional operating in a stressful environment.
And I think the most shocking aspect was the suggestion that this disaster might actually serve a constructive purpose.
Exactly. One commentary in the media actually suggested that if the disaster led the U.S. to move away from its obsession with symbolic nuclear arms control and to concentrate on the problems of warfighting, then 290 people will not have died in vain.
That is just a breathtaking level of moral abstraction.
It is. The idea that the deaths of 290 unworthy victims could be reframed as a beneficial opportunity for U.S. strategic gain, that is precisely the kind of thought control Chomsky is illustrating.
And when the Vincennes returned home, it was met with a boisterous, flag-waving welcome,
reinforcing the narrative that it was just an unfortunate accident, not a war crime.
That systematic differential treatment really proves that the media's function is not to report facts, but to uphold this doctrine of defensive intent, regardless of the human cost.
Right.
Let's move now into a deeper systems analysis. How is this conformity enforced beyond, just the threat of lost advertising revenue? What are the key institutional constraints?
Well, we've established a resource constraint. The control over wealth and the means of information production is narrowly concentrated, and that shapes every aspect of social life.
Okay.
But the second constraint is perhaps even more powerful because it regulates the political system itself. It's the demand constraint, often referred to as investor confidence.
This acts like a kind of self-regulating economic leash on what's politically possible.
It is a profound, almost invisible control mechanism. Any political system, any politician that attempts to permit broader policy options like social reform programs, wealth redistribution, increased worker protections.
They immediately face an implicit or explicit capital strike.
Yes. This results in capital flight, a sharp loss of business confidence, and investor backlash, which very quickly paralyzes the economy and forces the government to retreat to policies that are favored by the investment class.
So even if a politician is elected with a genuinely populist mandate, the system itself forces them to adhere to investor interests just to prevent economic collapse.
That's the structural constraint. And this mechanism is absolutely central to what the political scientist Thomas Ferguson termed the investment theory of politics.
Okay, let's elaborate on that theory because it seems critical for understanding the reality of choice in a managed system.
The investment theory argues that political systems, particularly in large Western democracies like the U.S., effectively reduce down to interactions among competing groups of major investors.
These groups representing different segments of capital, like finance, or manufacturing, or high-tech.
Right, and they compete for control of the state, but they're not competing over fundamental ideology. They're competing over tactical approaches to best protect and enhance their collective interests.
So the general public is largely relegated to the role of spectators.
Exactly. They're only called upon for periodic ratification in elections that present these carefully managed choices between two investor-funded factions.
So the actual policy options are already constrained by the movement of capital before the public even gets to weigh in.
The bounds of acceptable political discourse are set by the investment theory.
And those bounds are reinforced by that core ideological assumption we mentioned earlier, the doctrine of defensive intent. Can you explain how this assumption manages both domestic perception and foreign policy?
So the doctrine asserts that the U.S. state is invariably adopting a defensive posture. It's always just resisting challenges to order, whether they're domestic or foreign.
And this doctrine is so entrenched that it defines reality, even when the U.S. is manifestly the aggressor.
Think back to the war in Vietnam. It was never framed as an aggression. It was consistently framed as the vigorous defense of a free people who were resisting communist aggression.
Even when the U.S. literally installed a brutal dictatorship and blocked promised democratic elections.
Precisely. The U.S. opposed the unifying elections that were scheduled for 1956 because all the intelligence indicated that the wrong side, Ho Chi Minh, would win something like 80% of the vote.
So the U.S. installed the murderous DM dictatorship in the South.
And the media, adhering to the doctrine, reported this as defending democracy against internal aggression. This framework dictates that the U.S. is always the source of good, and any violence it uses is merely restoring order or defending freedom.
And this same doctrine, I assume, determines how the media defines democracy and freedom in its client states.
Absolutely. For U.S. policy purposes, democracy is achieved when a society is firmly under the control of local oligarchies, business elites linked to U.S. investors, and a military apparatus that's under U.S. influence.
And any popular challenge to that status quo
Especially one advocating for domestic needs over investment needs.
is defined as a threat.
And that entitles the U.S. to use violence or support proxy forces to restore democracy. That's the whole basis of the Reagan doctrine in Central America.
This allows the media to completely disregard verifiable facts about political conditions in these client states, like that 1987 poll in El Salvador,
Right.
where, despite constant praise for its supposed fledgling democracy, only 10% of the population actually believed that a process of democracy and freedom existed.
The system simply concludes that those benighted Salvadorans must not understand the superior concept of democracy that's being delivered to them by the U.S. and its local allies.
The systemic necessity is just maintaining conditions favorable to U.S. power and investment.
Regardless of popular support or actual human rights conditions.
So we have the economic constraints and we have the ideological assumptions. Now, how does the system handle outright dissent or external verification that challenges the narrative? This is where the filtering and marginalization of dissent come into play, the system's feedback loops.
Right. When international institutions produce unwanted results that contradict the doctrine of defensive intent, the system simply dismisses them as hostile forums. The prime and perhaps most infamous example is the U.S. treatment of the World Court.
In 1986, the International Court of Justice condemned the U.S. for the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua.
Specifically referring to the mining of their harbors and the support of the Contra-terrorists, and it demanded that U.S. aid to the Contras be terminated immediately.
And what was the subsequent action of the U.S. government and the media?
Well, the U.S. Congress, immediately following the ruling, voted for $100 million in military aid to implement that exact unlawful use of force.
So they just ignored the jurisdiction of the World Court.
Completely. And even more revealing was the media response. The ruling was virtually suppressed, ignored by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major networks.
And when the Times finally did comment on it,
It dismissed the court as a hostile forum, neglecting to mention that the court had rigorously reviewed the evidence and explicitly rejected the U.S. claim of collective self-defense.
so the press, which champions the rule of law when it applies to official enemies, conveniently forgets it when it applies to the U.S.
And this pattern is very consistent whenever the U.S. is isolated on the global stage. Consider UN General Assembly votes.
Okay.
In late 1987, during this intense media focus on President Reagan's arms control efforts, the UN General Assembly voted 154-1, with the U.S. alone in opposition against the buildup of weapons in outer space.
154-1.
They also voted 137-3 for a nuclear test ban, with the U.S. joined only by its client states Britain and France in opposition.
And these overwhelming votes, where the U.S. stood virtually isolated against the world.
Or routinely unreported by major media outlets, because they contradicted the necessary illusion that the U.S. was the primary global proponent of peace and arms reduction.
The propaganda system, therefore, works in two ways. It manufactures the necessary illusions, and it actively filters out inconvenient reality.
And this leads to what Chomsky calls his second-order prediction, that the acceptable debate over media performance will itself be rigidly bounded.
How is that boundary enforced?
Well, You are permitted to criticize the media, but only from one direction.
You can argue that the media is too liberal, too adversarial, or harbors an anti-U.S. or an anti-Israel bias.
Exactly. But the possibility that the media conforms to the propaganda model, that it is structurally submissive to state and corporate power, is excluded from mainstream discussion entirely.
And that very exclusion reinforces the ideological system.
It does. When rigorous academic studies, like manufacturing consent, are published confirming the propaganda model, they are typically either ignored or bitterly condemned, which fulfills the third-order prediction that the system protects itself even from analysis of the system.
And this circularity, it reinforces the need for what he calls propaganda necessity.
Right. Claims required for ideological warfare must be reiterated constantly, even when they're privately acknowledged to be groundless.
The persistent claim of ample evidence of Sandinista aid to Salvadoran guerrillas is a quintessential example of this.
It is. This claim was the official justification for the entire Contra War. Despite the World Court reviewing and rejecting the public evidence, despite the CIA privately admitting the evidence was non-existent.
And despite the New York Times foreign editor privately acknowledging that the reporting on this was imprecise,
The claim persisted for years in the media as a foundational truth. It was required for justifying U.S. foreign policy. If the system needs an illusion to be true, if it's necessary for ideological coherence, it will be reiterated insistently until the public accepts it as fact.
Now, let's bring these concepts forward into a more contemporary discussion. Let's focus first on how the management of the term terrorism functions as a propaganda tool.
The definition of terrorism is arguably the most powerful propaganda device in the modern arsenal. Chomsky notes that terrorism is defined as such only when it's conducted by official enemies.
Usually those without significant ties to U.S. capital, Iran, Libya, or the PLO at the time he was writing.
Right. But when the U.S. and its clients are the agents, the exact same acts of violence are immediately reframed as something benign, defensive democracy, or the highly technical and misleading term low-intensity conflict, or LIC.
What exactly is LIC doctrine?
LIC is a calculated euphemism. It's officially defined by the U.S. as a level of force that falls short of outright aggression, but it's precisely the kind of force designed to destabilize, harass, and coerce civilian populations and emerging governments that resist U.S. power.
So Chomsky argues that the U.S. is unusual in that it is officially committed to international terrorism,
particularly through its endorsement of this LIC doctrine.
Can you provide some specific, striking examples of U.S. state-sponsored terrorism that were systematically excluded from the narrative of international terrorism at the time?
Sure, look at the CIA-arranged car bombing in Beirut in 1985. The goal was to assassinate Sheikh Fadlallah, but the massive bomb killed 80 innocent people, mostly women and children, and injured hundreds more.
80 people.
Chomsky points out that this attack was likely the single major terrorist act in terms of civilian casualties of that peak year of the so-called official plague of terrorism.
And yet because it was sponsored by the U.S.,
it was excluded from the narrative. It was reduced to a regrettable incident if it was reported at all.
Similarly, the actions of U.S. proxy forces in Nicaragua are a perfect mirror of what we would call enemy terrorism.
They're textbook examples. The Contra forces, which were funded and trained by the U.S., focused extensively on attacking civilian targets, agricultural cooperatives, health clinics, schools.
These are precisely the kind of deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure that the U.S. denounces with horror when they're committed by official enemies, like Abu Nidal.
Absolutely. By rigorously adhering to this utility-driven definition of terrorism where only the enemy can commit the crime, the media maintains the necessary illusion of a Soviet-based worldwide terror network while sanitizing U.S. actions.
Let's shift to the political structure itself. The investment theory of politics suggested that true choice is constrained. So how does the political system maintain the appearance of choice?
Well, Chomsky noted that most Western democracies were trending toward the U.S. model of one political party with two controlled factions.
Right, and these factions are controlled by shifting segments of the business community,
which ensures that the only viable political debate revolves around minor tactical disagreements within a very narrow elite consensus. This system structurally marginalizes any parties that might genuinely represent the interests of working people, or the poor, or other dissenting interests.
And if that managed choice is challenged, how is internal dissent restrained at home? We saw the Red Scares historically. What are the more modern mechanisms?
Historically, yes, Wilson and McCarthyism deployed highly effective Red Scares to crush labor movements and eliminate any articulate challenge to business domination. The more modern efforts involve overcoming the so-called Vietnam Syndrome.
Which is the public revulsion against the use of force.
Exactly. And, crucially, promoting a culture of narcissism.
A culture that convinces young people and the public to be primarily concerned only for themselves and their private pursuits.
It's a mechanism of fragmentation. By fostering individualism, consumption, and self-concern, the system actively dissolves the organizational forms that provide isolated individuals with the means to think and to act outside the framework imposed by private power.
So the goal is to isolate individuals, making them powerless objects of propaganda, marketing, and consumption.
And thereby preventing them from organizing into cohesive political forces that might actually challenge the structure of privilege.
This all suggests a profound cynicism underlying the stated values of democracy. And I think the ultimate test of the system's ideological sincerity is revealed when we compare the coverage of civil liberties violations in an enemy state versus a client state.
This is the critical, controlled experiment that history occasionally provides us. We have to compare the pervasive, decades-long outrage over Sandinista censorship of the U.S.-funded opposition newspaper La Prensa in Nicaragua
Right.
versus the near-total silence regarding far more draconian repression in the U.S. client state of Israel.
And Nicaragua was actively fighting a U.S. proxy war, which provided some context for temporary censorship or harassment of a newspaper actively funded by its enemy. The outrage was astronomical.
Oh, the coverage was relentless. It was used as proof of Sandinista totalitarianism across the entire political spectrum. However, now turn to Israel. The U.S. client state was operating under draconian laws inherited from the British colonial regulations.
Which permit the permanent, indefinite closure of Arab newspapers.
Yes, papers like Al-Mathak and Al-Ad, on vague grounds of state security, without any meaningful judicial review.
And this permanent closure of newspapers was upheld by the highest court in Israel.
It was. This repression, the permanent silencing of dissent, upheld by the Supreme Court, it far exceeded the temporary harassment and suspensions faced by La Prensa in Nicaragua.
Yet the permanent closure received virtually no coverage or protest in the U.S. media.
Or among the self-proclaimed civil libertarians who were so deeply concerned about Nicaragua.
This comparison just strips away the stated concern for press freedom, doesn't it? It exposes it as a cynical tool of thought control.
The indignant defense of press freedom is simply a system component. It's designed to serve the purpose of demonizing the enemy and upholding the doctrine of defensive intent. Chomsky dryly notes that critics of Nicaraguan abuses who pass the elementary test of sincerity, that is, applying the same standards to themselves and their allies, could easily fit into a single, small living room.
The structural imperative just overrides any pretense of universal moral standards.
Completely.
This entire deep dive has been focused on analyzing systems, which is the core lens of this program. Let's formally connect Chomsky's work to these broader themes, starting with the primacy of institutional factors over individual intent.
We have to relentlessly focus on the institutional factors that determine actions and beliefs and, just disregard the psychology of the actors.
Yeah.
The system selects for compliance.
So the person who ultimately becomes the chairman of the board of a media conglomerate or a powerful political executive might genuinely believe they're serving noble ends.
They may believe they are promoting freedom and prosperity.
But if they stopped following the institutional imperatives, if the CEO genuinely prioritized human needs over profit maximization, or if the media executive prioritized objective truth over corporate interest, they would simply cease to hold that position.
They would be removed by market forces, by shareholder revolt, or by political marginalization. The constraints of the institution force compliant behavior.
And that's why we must not confuse the pathology of the individual with the structure of the system.
Right. Even historical figures who were engaged in systematic brutality, like the architects of the Holocaust, they often convinced themselves they were doing necessary, noble work for their state. The analysis must always ignore their souls and focus on the systemic constraints that enforce their behavior.
Moving to foreign policy, the book explains how this power is embedded in institutions designed for global management, which Chomsky terms the grand area concept.
This concept traces U.S. foreign policy planning all the way back to the post-World War II period. While it was often masked by rhetoric like containment, the fundamental design was to establish a global system, the grand area, that was subordinated to the needs of the U.S. economy.
The goal being to ensure U.S. business interests could thrive globally, dominated by U.S. political control.
And without interference from protective devices or nationalistic barriers?
And the most consistent underlying threat identified in these planning documents wasn't necessarily Soviet aggression, but popular domestic movements within those subordinate nations.
Absolutely. The threat was repeatedly identified as nationalistic regimes that were responsive to domestic pressures for improved living standards, social reform, and independent development.
So, regimes showing insufficient regard for the needs of U.S. investors.
That's the phrase. This global management required necessary illusions at home, specifically the doctrine of defensive intent, supplemented by the periodic, forceful intervention of the military to restore order.
Finally, let's address the profound issue of the illusions of freedom within managed systems. We have formal rights, but are they robust?
The entire system is predicated on maintaining the appearance of democracy, the formal rights, while ensuring the reality of managed political life.
And we have to remember that these formal rights, like freedom of speech and the right to vote, they weren't inherent gifts.
Not at all. They were gained only by unremitting popular struggle that directly challenged existing social arrangements and power structures, often in the face of violent state repression.
Chomsky notes just how fragile these rights are. He points out that the First Amendment, specifically concerning the crime of criticizing the government, wasn't fully established until a Supreme Court ruling in 1964.
1964, overturning the logic of the Sedition Act of 1798.
That realization should really give us pause. The central meaning of freedom of expression is relatively recent and perpetually contested.
It is. The system's ultimate constraint is that policy must not deviate from the perceived needs of domestic power and privilege. Consequently, freedom of expression is structurally limited to that which conforms to doctrinal presuppositions, which reinforces the boundaries of acceptable debate and ensures that dissent remains marginal, isolated, and ineffectual.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's reflect on what necessary illusions fundamentally helps us see differently about our political and media landscape.
Well, it radically shifts our understanding of the media's function. Its primary role is not to inform without bias, but to reinforce a kind of state religion that incorporates submission to the masters of the system of public subsidy and private profit.
So the consistent pattern of dichotomous reporting, of selective outrage, the suppression of inconvenient international law, and adherence to state doctrine, it's not an accident.
It is the predictable, systemic function of institutions that are constrained by corporate power and the investment theory of politics.
Why does this systems-level perspective matter so much for the learner and the citizen today?
Because democratic systems of thought control are highly effective precisely because they are so subtle. They operate via exclusion and framing rather than overt censorship. And they are most effective among the educated elites, who are the prime targets for managing the acceptable discourse.
So understanding the structural constraints, the resource constraint, the demand constraint, the necessity of propaganda, it allows you to apply a critical filter to the news you consume.
And to remember that the victories won for freedom and civil liberties are fragile and unstable. They constantly require popular determination and vigilance to protect the space for independent thought.
And that raises the ultimate provocative thought for us to consider. If the fundamental design of the system is to manufacture consent and protect entrenched privilege by reducing the public to an object of manipulation,
then what capacity does a society truly have to self-correct when its own self-correcting institutions, like the free press, are in fact functioning as adjuncts of government?
it suggests that genuine systemic change cannot be achieved simply by electing better leaders or hoping for moral awakenings within major institutions.
It must come from organized, independent, popular resistance that challenges those fundamental power arrangements that constrain the possibility of democracy.
We have been deep diving into the enduring analysis of thought control in modern society.
Our exploration has been guided by the essential work of Noam Chomsky, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, to examine the voluminous evidence he presents, support the author if you found these ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.